This podcast is brought to you by the Albany Public Library main branch and the generosity of listeners like you. What is a podcast? God, Daddy, these people talk as much as you do. Razib Khan's unsupervised learning.
Thanks for listening to the ungated version of the Unsupervised Learning podcast. If you want to read some essays on some of these topics, please check out razib.substack.com. Again, that's razib.substack.com. Thank you.
You know that genetics plays a huge role in our health, and more people are using genetic testing to determine risk for diseases like cancer for themselves and their kids than ever before. So I want to tell you about Orchid. It's the only company that does whole genome testing for embryos, testing before your child is born. If you're doing IVF, this is a clear choice now because now you can reduce risk for thousands of single gene disorders, including heritable forms of autism, pediatric cancers, and birth defects. Check them out at orchidhealth.com.
Hey, everybody. This is Razib with the Unsupervised Learning Substack and podcast. And today I'm here with Katherine Brodsky of Katherine Writes at the Random Minds Substack. Now, those of you who have been listening for a while probably, remember her from, well, it's been a little over a year. I feel like we were talking about this before she got on. It's just like time and all the things that have happened. I feel, I think most of you will probably agree with me. There's been a lot of history that has happened in the 2020s in these 3 years in a way. And a lot of it has also been really weird because during the pandemic, a lot was happening, but it was also like time was frozen. A lot of us were not going to the office. A lot of us were not doing things that we would do, like meeting with relatives during Thanksgiving. And so I think it's caused like a weird sense of this decade, because it is 3 years now. We're almost in 2024, of like what has happened. Like it's kind of like all mushed together in a goulash, maybe, which that's a reference to something we might talk about later. But most of the time, I try to talk about things that aren't super relevant to the news, make it evergreen. But we are going to be talking about a little newsy stuff, but I have to say it's not one of those things that's going to come and go. So, we talked about OpenAI and Sam Altman, stuff like that. Okay, that's 6 months from now. That's a historical artifact. I don't think what we're going to talk about is unfortunately going to be a historical artifact 6 months from now. Some of this is good. Yeah, some of this is still going to be live in terms of stuff that's happening. I know some of you say that I should let the people talk earlier, but I'm going to set this up a little bit. I do read the comments and I do read the feedback, and I don't care all the time. In fact, I don't care most of the time. Not going to lie.
It's a nice way to be.
Yeah, on the Big Five, I'm very disagreeable. But in any case, the way I want to set this up is, so as we're recording, it has been not quite 2 months, but almost 2 months since 10/7. And I feel in America, at least, 10/7 is kind of like 9/11. I think there's something in Britain that happened in 2005. I don't remember the date. I'm sorry, British people, with the subway bombings, But, these dates are kind of in your head. And America and Israel, we're connected countries in a lot of ways. A lot of Israelis are American. They're dual citizenship because, Aliyah and the migration, and since 1967, and, the last, this has been like 4 decades, America and Israel have had a pretty close relationship. American elites, Israeli elites, the current prime minister, Bibi Netanyahu, who's been the prime minister for most of the last 25 years. He has a mostly American accent that he obtained, when he was a student at MIT. These, we're closely connected countries. People in other parts of the world, especially what they now call the global South, are not the same. Do not have the same perception. Large immigrant communities in the West do not have the same perception. So it's interesting because you get different viewpoints in terms of who you empathize with and who you identify with. So from an American perspective, and because I'm saying this from an American perspective because other people did not understand this, the stuff that was coming out of 10/7, what happened to Israelis, Israeli civilians, Israeli children, what happened to them, the things that happened. And I mean, I'm not going to you can look it up. Okay. Maybe we'll talk about it in detail. I mean, Katherine can talk about it if she wants to, but it was like stuff that, I'm laughing. I'm not laughing because it's funny. It was just stuff that you would be taught about the Holocaust, right? And so there was a real strong emotional reaction to that. And then there was the bombing of Gaza, and they keep saying X thousands of children have died. Well, I mean, that makes sense because half of people in Gaza are children. The average age is 18. The median age is 18. So by definition, right? And so you're having, these atrocities that are very, they're kind of reminiscent of kind of the worst, more personalized aspects of the Holocaust. So obviously there was the industrial, extermination in the camps. So what I said was a lot of the stuff that Hamas did, the fighters did, reminded me of stuff that I would read about the ISIS group and the SS units on the Eastern Front in particular. And they would go out into the country and they would hunt Jewish families, And so that's what it reminded me of. So there's a lot of emotional reactions to that. A lot of discussions about anti-Semitism. What is anti-Semitism? I think some of the reactions were a little overwrought, but I understand why they were in the context. And now it's been a couple of months, and we're still having a lot of the same discussions and same debates. There hasn't been like a great resolution. I have friends who are much more anti-Israel, I would say, or much more pro-Palestinian than I am, although, not like incredibly so. And so, we've had some discussions and had different perspectives, and it's really complicated. And I don't think, we're not going to solve that on this podcast. And there's no way that it's going to be solved on the Twitter/X site. This is going to be a multi-generational discourse and discussion. But I want to get Katherine's perspective because, I'm just going to put it out there. She is Jewish. She has had some experiences. And I think I'm not totally a person that your lived experience, which what experience is not lived, but whatever, trumps everything. And that should be, that should be the most important thing. But when someone says something and you can just refute it by what you yourself have experienced, and I've done this before too. I'm just like, I don't really care what you say. Like, I've experienced it. So I don't really care that you say that it doesn't happen. It happened because it happened to me. Right. And so that's why sometimes it's important to talk to people. And so that's why I want to talk to her. And, we're not going to just talk about the Israel stuff today, but I want to start out with, that and also being Jewish in the West, which that's a weird thing to say now, but I guess we got to say it now. It's a weird position, but so, yeah, I mean, I've been talking for a while, Katherine. If you want to, introduce yourself again or whatever, go ahead. But really, you've been in Hungary for a while. You came back to North America, and I think you traveled in various places in Europe as well. Tell me what you experienced. Tell me how you're feeling. And I don't usually do tell me how you're feeling, but you have some interesting perspective from my perspective, so that's why I'm curious.
Yeah, I mean, I do think where the relevancy is that it is a bit different because in my situation, I was born in what is now Ukraine and hopefully will stay Ukraine. And then my family had basically, escaped to Israel. So I actually had lived in Israel and I lived there during the Gulf War. So, having had that experience as a child of having to wear a gas masks and rockets, exploding near me and kind of growing up with terrorist attacks all the time, like you were always hearing about it. I do think it lends a perspective. And I think in particular, understanding also the human aspect of what it's like to live there, seeing, for example, things like that people I don't think understand, like diversity of different kinds of people, right? There's been this narrative that, everyone in Israel is white, but, 20% of the population is Arab. Then there's other groups. And then amongst Jews, there's so many more Mizrahi Jews. I think Ashkenazi Jews, which are the European ones, make up like 30%. So it's not even a majority. So I think it's important to kind of contextualize it. And I have to say, I mean, some things I knew, some things I took a lot of time to learn and listen to, including like the Palestinian perspective. And over the years, I've also talked to Palestinians. So like, I think it's important to be sort of aware of the situation. But when I heard about, when October 7th happened, I will say it was just absolutely jarring. And I was so glued and I was so deeply affected by it, as I'm sure as many. And being somebody who is Jewish, you're much more likely to know people who were directly affected by it. So when people go on the internet and talk about how, this is fake, this is Israeli propaganda, I do think there is a different outlook there, because the people whose family members have been killed, and that they've been killed in the most horrific ways, and that wasn't Israel who did it. And also, I think the other part of it is like, I think there's a lot of political issues in Israel. There's political issues when it comes to, Gaza and the West Bank. But ultimately, I think growing up there, I realized like the Israeli perspective. And I think there's a tendency to sort of, for people who are not familiar, who are just hearing about it, they're like, well, they want vengeance. They just want to kill people in Gaza. And knowing the people there, I know that to be absolutely not true. Even the government that I might not be like perfectly happy with myself, like the Netanyahu government, it's just very different to know that it isn't true. And knowing that I grew up with the narrative being that we need to live in peace, two-state solution. Rabin was the prime minister at the time, and what we were taught in schools, and the contrast of that. So with me, like we would draw doves for peace, and we were taught to sort of love other people and hope for peace. So that context, I think, is really important, and that's context that is missing.
Yeah. So, people, this is just so cliche, but you have to humanize people, and, I don't, one of my best friends from high school, his father's his father's Israeli Arab. I think they call themselves Palestinians now. He calls himself a Palestinian. They're from Nazareth. His mother's white American. And so I knew some of that perspective, and it's difficult also. And I don't know what you think. It's like the polarization is, and as a person who's not, I guess I'm not party to either side is what I would say. I don't really identify strongly with either side. I know a lot more Jews, and I actually know a fair amount of Israelis because I work in tech. So that's one particular thing. Tech in particular is a lot of Israelis come to the United States and they work here for a while, then they go back to Israel, which is why it's got a big tech sector. But yeah, I know people in tech who were directly affected by the kidnappings and murders in the kibbutz, like immediately. And I think a lot of people who work in the tech sector know that too. So we have an immediate personal connection, less so, with the Palestinians. If you're Muslim American, if you're Arab American, obviously you have a closer personal connection. And so that's a different perspective, and it's difficult, I think, to parse everything. I mean, one thing I guess I would say is, they say Israel is an apartheid state. And then, the response is, well, it's the only democracy in the Middle East. Well, let's set aside Iraq now. But,
I think, I obviously disagree with that characterization, but I understand why people make that statement. I think the reason being, basically, it's sort of unsettled, right? So Gaza and the West Bank and Israel does have a presence, at least in the West Bank, not in Gaza for quite a few years. But there are certain things that Israel controls, and it controls it because of security aspects. So, however, I think in most Israeli minds, like you don't think of these regions as being part of Israel. So within Israel, it's a full-on democracy. Arabs enjoy the exact same rights and freedoms as people in Palestine, or Palestinians. So see, even in my mind, I kind of think of these as separate entities, and that's why people don't really see it as in that context.
Well, I mean, some people, they see it, they think of it as one entity from the river to the sea. Sorry.
There is that too, which is here's the problem with that is this. Even if you say, okay, there were these injustices, which, I think it's a much more, when people talk about the mikvah, I've looked into it. The Israeli perspective would be that, historically what had happened, they were fighting, Arabs were attacking, and at certain point when they were attacked in 1948, Israel was attacked. it basically, the Arab leaders at the time, they said, look, they told the Palestinians, look, leave, and we will sort of win this fight, and you'll be able to come back. It would be easier for us to fight if you're not there. And Israel won, and then people did lose their homes because they weren't able to come back. Now, I'm sure there were like lots of things that went wrong on both the Palestinian side, and I do call them Palestinians because I understand that they historically might be Arabs, but they've lived on that land. That's kind of their identity, and identities form over different periods of time. So I don't mind doing that. But I think what happened was there is this sort of, I think there was a lot of bad actions and at the time, and I would say, very likely on both sides of this. And so, but I think the stories that were later told, like regardless of what the origin is, I think we have to deal today with the reality today. And I think we don't have peace at the expense of that, because I'd be very willing to sort of negotiate, and I want people in, just because I support Israel doesn't mean I don't support Palestinians, and I want them to have a good life. I don't want to see people being killed. And I do think there's some things that are unfair about their treatment. However, if you keep holding on to grievances from the past, whether they're justified or not, you can't move on and build a better future, which is ideally what we want for everyone.
Yeah, that's fair. I don't talk about it on this podcast, but I did guest on another podcast where I was asked about Ashkenazi Jewish genetics, and
I asked you about it too.
Yeah, and people are always asking me, and I'm like, that's fine, but like, nobody really cares. Like, it could turn out that the Palestinians are Chinese, would have zero effect. I mean, like, if you found out something super weird, I don't think it would have any effect. And so I'm just like, well,
I mean, I'll talk about the conversation because everyone's trying to make it like, okay, who's been there longer? Well, you know what, Jews have been there longer, but does that matter necessarily? I'm not sure actually that it does, because ultimately, like I said, we have to live with the reality of today. The only reason that I would bring that up or is because it becomes a matter of conversation.
Sure.
But people have changed. It has changed hands over long periods of times. And yes, there were certainly lots of Jews there back in the day, many years ago, and then Jews living there throughout. But there were also Palestinians or Arabs or however you want to define it.
Yeah, I mean, history is interesting and complicated. I mean, honestly, there's a lot of stuff in the first half of the 20th century it is interesting. I'm not sure how relevant it is anymore. So, for example, and you can correct me or disagree, I can understand the critique that Israel and Zion, because the Ashkenazis are 30%. Today, but it's a very different state than it was in the 1940s, when there was a mass influx for various reasons of Ashkenazi Jews into Israel, and these Jews are European Jews, Yiddish or culturally mostly. I mean, some of them were English speaking as well, whatever, but European Jews, European people, and yes, in Europe they might have been seen as alien and the other, but they did view themselves as part of Western European civilization. And they brought socialism. They were leftist. Many of them were influenced by Marxism. And as you know, Israel was initially, kind of supported by the Soviet Union to some extent. So, the history is a little bit more complicated. But what's the point? I mean, I guess what I would say is we live in the now. I think it is relevant to us. What happened at the summits in the early 2000s and with Rabin in the 90s. I mean, I was alive then, you were alive then, we remember that. These are things that are happening in the now. And similarly with the Palestinians, I do want to ask you one question. Then I want to move from Israel to, just being Jewish in Europe and North America now. But one thing that I would say is, within Israel, let's just set aside the West Bank and the indignities that Palestinians have to suffer because of the security state, whether it's justified or not. We don't need to get into that.
Fair enough. Yeah.
In Israel itself, I think it is true from everything I've heard that legally Arabs have the same rights, equality before the law, but socially and culturally they do suffer discrimination, and they do have to deal with, there are people in Israeli life and Israeli society that express levels of extreme chauvinism and ethnocentrism that are not typical or that are taboo in most Western countries. Not in Arab countries, but in Western countries, yes.
I will say, though, the key word here is how typical they are and how majority of people treat it, and also how the government treats it. I think those are very important things. So no doubt there's nasty people, right? I mean, every group of people is going to have their own bigoted people, jerks, all that kind of stuff. There's no reason why Jews or Israelis shouldn't be an exception, should be an exception to that. And I've talked to Palestinians who live in Israel who, have shared their stories with me, and I completely believe them, and I have great empathy. So it's like we've had racism in here, in the US, in Canada, everywhere there is racism. So that exists, and there are people who accept them as well with zero reservation. It's very important to look at. It's like every time I would see videos being presented of some horrible racist tirade, right? Or somebody saying, let's level Gaza. And then other people will present videos on the Palestinian side. And I think what's important is like, okay, how much of that is reflective of the overall society? And I would say, and look, I will say, I haven't lived in Israel for a long time. So I do have blind spots in that area. I have visited quite recently. I would say the vast majority of people do not hold radical views when it comes to Palestinians or Arabs, but obviously some do, and that's a problem. It's the same thing with what I've learned is that there's some really religious, I will call them extremists, who attack, for example, Christians. And all of that behavior is completely abhorrent and unacceptable. But I also don't think that it reflects the vast majority of the population. And the laws also have to reflect, equal rights, which the laws do, whereas laws in other countries in the Middle East do not. And I think that's an incredibly important distinction.
Yeah. From what I know, I do think it's interesting. It's interesting. I'm using that word too much, but it's
a lot of saying interesting things. I'm just kidding.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Israel has, really in a way the most prosperous, free Arab. I mean, I'm gonna get in trouble. Some people are gonna get angry. Community in the Middle East, right? Probably does. Okay. But I also think socially, to some extent, they're second-class citizens in terms of Israel is the homeland of the Jewish people, right? Mm-hmm. And that's a little weird to say anymore, even though, I don't know, the Netherlands, like the Denmark is the nation of the Danes, but it's just like not explicitly stated anymore,
I think that's the thing. I think that's the way people look at it. And I think there's a lot of confusion, and we'll get into that because it's an ethno-religion. So people sort of look at, when they hear Jewish, they think of it as a religion often, as opposed to an ethnicity. Whereas I am somebody who's not religious. So for me, it's completely ethnicity. It doesn't matter whether I believe in God or not. I'm going to still be Jewish when I wake up tomorrow, right? And I think what happens there is that so one thing I did, because like a lot of people have brought up the law of return as something that's, you can say it's racist. But when I started looking into it, and I myself was surprised because part of me did think maybe that is true. And when I started looking into countries with similar policies, for immigration, so it's essentially it's an ancestry-based immigration policy. I think you have to really look at it that way. And it's not actually unique in the world, because you You have that in England, in Britain, you have that in Australia, you have that in the US, you have it in a lot of places across the world.
In Germany.
Germany, yeah. So it's actually not unique. And I was actually surprised to learn that myself once I looked at it. But I think the way it's presented, because it's presented as being this special thing for Jews, and again, people kind of conflate being Jewish with just religion, which there's a very small percentage of non-ethnic Jews who converted to Judaism. And also the idea of ethno-religion isn't unique to Jews either. So I think it's really important to sort of contextualize these things. And I think a lot of times people don't. And like I said, I myself was missing that information.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of these things are also like on X or on Twitter, whatever you want to call it. They're blasted out as like, like a 3-sentence tweet without context. And I kind of want to, like, a lot of times I just like, I want to respond, and then I'm like, no, I'm not gonna. No, this is not. You know what I'm saying?
Oh, I definitely know what you're saying, and I've been way too brought in, but I really struggle with this because I'm very much like, if somebody presents me with a fact, regardless of whether it supports my obviously I do have a bias towards Israel, but somebody presents a particular fact, I'll sort of consider it, and I'll say, that you've got a valid point. But I think the problem is people aren't often going off of accurate information, and in particular on platforms like X, but any social media, TikTok, anywhere, you're basically, people are ripping off. They'll take a headline, they'll put their own kind of phrasing on it that completely puts it into a completely different context if they're using a video or an image. There's a lot of cases where they'll use an image or video from Syria and say that it's in Gaza. There's a lot of AI generated imagery, which, by the way, I thought about this. I'm like, look, obviously this is war. Like we said, kids are going to be dying, right? Other people are going to be dying in Gaza, whether, you think it's justified or not. You can't deny that there are deaths, civilian deaths of innocent people. But when you, so why even go through the trouble of creating an AI generated image? And I thought about it, and I'm like, okay, well, clearly it's about that image has a narrative attached to it that goes beyond, like, heroic father that's carrying the children, or the little boy, with a Palestinian flag shirt and his dead mother next to him, and he has his 6 fingers up. That's a kind of iconic image now. It's very symbolic, and a lot about this has become much more about propaganda and who can kind of put forward the best narrative. Like, even if you look at media, I was discussing this today. For example, if a publication publishes something about Gaza, they'll put an image of a child dying, right? And and buildings that have been broken. But if they publish a story about Israel, it's always like a soldier or a bulldozer or some kind of a tank. And I think these things weave a narrative that's not, it's, in a way, it's censoring the truth because it's presenting emotional kind of manipulation. And I think it's important for people to have the opinion you're going to have, but do it based on actual true facts, not based on just emotional manipulation.
Yeah. Well, I think that's called an emotional truth.
Yes, emotional truth.
One thing that I did notice, some people have pointed this out, is, and this is a thing that we noticed during, I know a lot of people have noticed this in the, what happened to the Yazidis. They quite clearly know which children will be photogenic to Western audiences. They're clearly picking out the ones with lighter eye colors.
Yeah.
And I think people know that means, I'm just going to say it, like, they're not Black African children starving, because, like, people do not care.
Yeah, they don't, because how much in these stories, like, there's so many wars going on.
Look, like, millions of people are on the run in Sudan right now.
Yeah.
And, like, literally, I never see it on my timeline, except for Matt Iglesias occasionally is just like, maybe I should retweet this.
Weird too.
Like,
because this is so framed as like, the white Israelis versus the, the Arabs, but yet they still pick, or the Palestinians, but they still will pick the kids that are going to appeal to the Western audience, as you say, which is. And
I'm not the only one that's noticed that, right? I mean, it's
no.
There's no way half of Palestinian kids have hazel or blue eyes.
No, and they're always like such beautiful children, which is also
like angels,
angels,
little
very innocent,
little angels being killed by Jews. Sorry.
I mean, I'm sorry. There is ugly kids everywhere, right? Like kids are not at all inherent. I'm gonna get into so much trouble.
Well, I mean, look, considering the conditions that they're in, they're awfully cleaned up too.
Yeah, exactly. No, I think that's a big deal. I think also with Israel, I imagine I'll be devil's advocate here, because I'll say the spokespeople that they tend to put forward do tend to also be Western looking. I think that's also part of why the impression is that, everyone in the IDF, for example, is white. But if you actually look at videos of the IDF, it's like black, brown, white, or very Arab kind of looking. If you go to Israel, it's like, honestly, I remember coming back, because as a child growing up there, I never really thought in terms of race. I never even understood what being Jewish was. So I didn't really think about things in those terms back then. But now living in areas that are, I have a lot of Asian people around me. I don't have a lot of Black people around me. And when I went to Israel, I remember being kind of really struck by the incredible diversity of just shades, right? Of, some of them are Jewish, some of them might not be, but like, it was like every category.
Yeah. Let's reiterate this just quantitatively, because a lot of people don't. Unless you're Jewish or have gone on birth. There are people who go on birthright who aren't Jewish, but so I'm not going to say just Jewish people. But if you haven't been to Israel or met Israelis, you might get a weird impression or misimpression. So Israel, as Katherine said, about 30% maybe Ashkenazi, and then of the remainder, 20% is Arab. And then of let's say the balance of the 50%, it's a mix of Sephardic Jews from, say, Morocco or, Turkey, Syria, Mizrahi Jews from Iraq, Persian Jews who are also classified as Mizrahi, but they're very into being Persian, Yemeni Jews that are kind of a different thing. And then you have the Beta Israel that are 2% of Israel's population. They're Ethiopian. And so
and
if you
Bedouin
see,
also, yeah.
Yeah. And so and the Bedouins, so if you see a Black person in Israel, I can usually tell East African versus non-East African. You could tell that they're Jewish, Beta Israel. There's also a Indian Jewish community there. So Israel is actually, the irony, or not the irony, I don't know how you want to say it, is actually one of the most ethnically diverse countries in the world, but it's unified, obviously, with 80% of the population under this broader Jewish rubric of identity and nationhood. But underneath it, there's a lot of diversity. Now, some of it is changing insofar as the Sabras, a lot of people, are half, Eilert Shaked is half Mizrahi, half, Ashkenazi. There's a lot of people that are mixed. It's not as big of a deal anymore. Once you stop having grandparents that were from the old country, basically just Israeli, these connections to the rest of the world don't matter. And, you talked about the Nakba. Well, obviously in the 50s, all the Iraqi Jews left. Most of the Moroccan Jews left, although that was more of a gradual affair. The Moroccan monarchy was actually pretty protective. But in Egypt,
Not
the Yemeni Jews yeah. And the Yemeni Jews were very, they were also, expelled. So these are people, some people call them Arab Jews. They don't consider themselves Arab because whatever, but they used to speak Arabic. And it was a pretty traumatic event for them. And these are often the people, aside from the Russian Jews, that are the most hawkish in Israel, as opposed to the more dovish Ashkenazi Jews that were, they're descendants of settler colonialists often, not always. Say some people came later on, but it's a very complicated country. So speaking of complicated, let's move to outside of the Israeli context, in Europe and North America. And, after 10/7 happened, I'm part of my X/Twitter community is kind of like adjacent or within academia. And it was really weird because a lot of my Jewish friends were really angry because their academic friends were quiet. And these are people that they do not shut the fuck up.
I know.
You know?
Yeah.
It's like anything that happens, like they got an opinion, they want to express solidarity, and that was like a wall of like silence, you know? And so, you know, they were really mad, and I was, you know, I'm more cynical, and I'm just like, who do you think these people were? You know, I mean, this was always who they were, you know what I'm saying? So I wasn't shocked.
Even though with like some of the so-called anti-woke warriors, where they also have an opinion on everything, and I found certain ones kind of invisibly quiet about this, and I thought that was interesting. Even though I sort of even knew their position, I was quite surprised by that, and I think there's something about this event that. Because you know, the left has always been far more supportive of Palestine and much more anti-Israel, and the right has traditionally been a bit more supportive of Israel. But I saw like there's a shift there, and I would say, yeah, that the right sort of split a bit also. And
well, it was hard to predict. I mean, I think there was a little bit of a horseshoe, far right, far left. You know, there were people who are far right who are more skeptical of Jewish power. You know, just like traditional anti-Semitism. Also, some people on the far right that are isolationists.
Yeah,
you know, and then there's people on the far left. So I think we have to say, in terms of Hamas is obviously
Sorry, I was just going to say there is. It's like the far left and the far right. A lot of their positions are kind of the same on a lot of topics. So I noticed.
Yeah, no, I mean, yeah, you. It's many such cases, they say. But I would also, we, you know, in terms of bringing up context into the Palestinian liberation movement, the Palestinian nationalism. You know, obviously Hamas is an Islamist movement, and Islamic radicalism is the big thing over the last generation in the Arab world. But actually, just to be clear, Palestinian nationalism does originally come out of left-wing secular nationalism. You know, the hijackings were pioneered by the PFLP, which is Marxist, founded by George Habash, who was atheist but from a Christian background and whatnot. And so, you know, Yasser Arafat himself, you know, he was not very religious. You know, he married a Christian woman. He was gay. I mean, I'm just gonna say it. You know,
what? Is this public fact?
Wait, why does everyone not know this?
I do not know this.
Yeah, like, I mean, there was a reason he didn't get married until he was really late. Until he was really late. He was really old. He had to get married and have children to be like kind of like a full man. But yeah, like, he would have sex with his bodyguards. His Romanian detail, like, because he had like Eastern European intelligence agencies worked with the PLO, you know. And so they knew that he's. I mean, I don't know if he would identify as gay. Okay, I don't know if he'd be on Castro.
I'm sure he wouldn't identify. Not in
yeah. But like he was batting for one
gay
team.
As gay does is what I would say.
Yeah, no, but he was batting for one team. He was a left-wing nationalist, you know. And so if you guys have watched the Baader Meinhof complex movie, the Red Brigades, they went to train with the PLO. I think the PLO were in, I don't know if they were in Tunisia or wherever they were at the time, but you know, there's connections between the PLO, between the IRA, between ETA, between all these left-wing nationalist movements that date to the 60s and 70s, and that still is there underlying some of these affinities, I would say. And you know, I think one of the, I could be wrong about this, but my understanding is that one of the reasons the PLO had to come to the peace talks, had to come to the table with Rabin in the 90s, was also collapse of the Soviet Union, exhausted and suffocated a lot of their support and funding channels. I mean, this happened to a lot of revolutionary movements that had to figure out like where next, right? So that's a context that I think is important to keep in mind when you're talking about like literal communists in the United States are very pro-Palestinian. Well, Palestinian national movement is a coalition. It's not communist, but there was a literal communist element. Communist Party still does exist, I think, in Israel as well. I think it's mostly an Arab party. the far left. It's an Arab party. And so this was very influential in the Arab world and in nationalism. Like in South Vietnam, in Vietnam, that was a left-wing nationalist movement as well. It's not just in the Islamic world or the Arab world. The country that I was born in, Bangladesh, I think it's still called the People's Republic of Bangladesh because it was a left-wing nationalist movement. And so this was just a big thing in the 60s and 70s. And today, that's history. But, history kind of creates a shadow over you. And so there's still these connections. And I think that that's what you're saying from the far left. What I think was interesting was, aside from the standard tanky, kind of like communist adjacent fellow traveler, there's the identity politics anti-colonialist brigade. And that was a whole new thing. And that is a whole new thing in the West. And it's basically, this is where the race stuff that we were talking about earlier comes into play, because they interpret everything as white versus non-white. And so you have a situation where Israelis have to become white by definition because they're the bad guys, and the Palestinians have to be non-white because they're the good guys. Which, like, if you look like at Mahmoud Abbas and like Netanyahu, I don't think you could tell who was who. Actually, Netanyahu seems like have much better tan, actually. But so it's kind of like ridiculous. I think this is why a lot of people who know Israel are a little confused. Also, I have to say, when they're trying to get hostages, when they're going to Gaza, they're yelling in Hebrew and telling people to yell in Hebrew if they're hostage. If they looked that different, they wouldn't have to do that. That indicates to you that they can look Palestinian.
Oh,
and vice
100%.
versa.
I was watching this academic he was arguing the pro-Palestinian position, and frankly, had you told me that this is a Jewish scholar, I would have he looked like an Ashkenazi Jew to me, frankly. So, I mean, there is really, I can differentiate very well between the two. But it's funny how well anti-Semites are very good at differentiating Jews from non-Jews in general, which I find spectacular. And that's why I think when we were talking privately about, whether Jews are white or Ashkenazi Jews, I guess, rather, are white, there's such a confusion of identity, even with me, like growing up. But because I guess the reason that I might have said, well, not really white, because it get identified and singled out by, certain kinds of people. And therefore, you don't feel like you're white. And then there's always I know that I look like a lot of different ethnicities. And so growing up, I mean, maybe a little less so right now with my current hair color, but my hair is naturally very dark and I have dark features and pale skin. And so people would growing up, people would just, I wanted to fit very badly in the Canadian world once I moved to Canada, and I had a really difficult time, and I felt like I was different. I felt like people always asked me where I was. Well, people still to this day ask me where I'm from. They think I look ethnic, and so and I remember really wanting to fit in and be sort of white growing up. And then I'm much more comfortable with whatever my identity is, but I also had a hard time understanding what is a Jewish person outside of I knew this is my culture, my background, but what does that mean? Is it Middle Eastern? Is it what is it? And so I think that's something that I think that's something that many Jews kind of struggle with. And so that's where the curiosity, and then it's okay, I don't feel like identifying white because we're singled out, and there were signs in the park in Toronto saying, no Jews or blacks or dogs allowed. You can drink the fountain, you can join certain things. So there was discrimination, but then you look historically at other groups that are sort of mixed in as being white, and Irish people faced a lot of discrimination. Italians, when they first came to the U.S., had a horrific time. I believe there were even lynchings. So it's so then it becomes okay, what is this white thing? Is it just? I mean, what about Black people who have very pale white skin, so they can be mixed up for being white? Are they still Black or are they white? Yeah.
No, I mean, it's easy to problematize insofar as it's not straightforward. I think in the current political discourse, it's made to be straightforward. I think what you're at, and it's frustrating, I think, for Jewish people. Most Jewish people that I know in the United States, probably not all, but I think most, have experienced some level of anti-Semitism. Sometimes not that great. Sometimes they're just kind of like annoying, but they clearly are seen to be different. And sometimes that is not good. And sometimes it can even be dangerous, in terms of, physical threats and stuff like that. So if I tell a Jewish person, well, you're white, they're just like, yeah, but like, I'm not white, like, Edward Smith.
Yeah.
Okay. Can we like figure out a way to say this where it's like, you don't like collapse the difference, because collapsing the difference, kind of erases not just my identity, but maybe, an aspect of my experience where it's like, don't act like I have all these privileges, like I went through shit too. And like, people don't want that, I would say the flip side, there's a flip side to this though. Since we're getting in trouble, also like, if you think about like Ivy League institutions, traditionally it's declining now, but they were like 20-25% Jewish, right? But that's not like, it's basically
but they also had quota systems before that where they didn't allow.
They did.
Right?
Yeah, they did. So it's like basically the Jews didn't want to be identified differently, because all of a sudden so for example, Asians, like they can't really hide.
No.
Like they're visibly different, and so they don't want them to be more than like 30% of the population of these schools, right? And so they cap them. Otherwise, it would start to look weird, quote unquote,
Yeah.
And so my point here is there is also a part of Jewish American identity where the Jewishness becomes less salient, and they become part of the mainstream, and that's probably pretty good. You probably don't want a lot of Americans always talking about, yeah, look at all those like people in Hollywood, like 80% of them are Jewish.
No, and
just think of them as white people, And
by the way, I don't think it's 80% at this point, but I think it's and I know you just picked a number, but I think that it's really difficult, because I would rather there be no categorization, because like, well, like I said, certain white people have gone through certain experiences. They're not all, it's just the color of their, face doesn't make them, I mean, they're all different groups as well, right? And so kind of lumping them all in together, I think is also not quite right, and with me, like with being Jewish, I think also there's a fundamentally difference in sometimes how you view it, being a Jew that grew up in America or North America and never had any other context where, it's somewhat, I would say it is somewhat you're somewhat accepted as part of the group, but you're still not quite 100% in. And also, if you look at hate crime statistics, that they're the highest, most targeted group. But also coming from, for example, the Soviet Union, as my family did, there was literally systemic discrimination, right? Where like it actually said you're Jewish in your passport, you couldn't hide it. Some people paid people off to erase it somehow, and bribe people. But as a Jew, you couldn't enter certain occupations. You were barred from a lot of things. You were discriminated against in very concrete ways. And so having a family that grew up with that, I haven't quite experienced that fully myself, being quite young when I left. But grew up with, my parents sharing their experiences. That is a different context, I think, too.
Yeah, I think, I 100% agree with you. Like, our ethnicity should be just kind of just like color in our background, and they shouldn't be determinative of anything. But, that's not the world we live in today, insofar as like, I just recently read a New Yorker piece about Jensen Wang, the CEO of NVIDIA, and like the New Yorker journalist is, talking about the cafeteria, and it's like 1/3 South Asian, 1/3 East Asian, 1/3 white, and they're mostly male, that's just called Silicon Valley. First of all, but people are looking at these things. And they're like, "Oh, this is weird," and like he put diverse in scare quotes, and I was just like, "Well, I mean, That is pretty diverse, actually. You know, I mean,
if you're gonna have people in your country, like you can control immigration, so you don't have an overrepresentation of any particular group, and that's, I think, is fair. But once you have those immigrants in your country, I think you have to treat them 100% the same as anybody else. So with Asians, for example, there should certainly not be like a quota because there's too many Asian people in the university. I think it's a completely awful thing. And I think this kind of idea of being racially blind, that's also like, you can't quite, I understand people have good intentions when they say this, or, you know, judge a person by their contents of their character, not their skin, which I agree with, the MLK thing, because that I like to look at people as individuals. But in terms of like completely obliterating somebody's reality that they face every day, because some people do have particular experiences, whether it's to do with discrimination because somebody might be Black or brown or Asian or whatever, or Jewish or whatever, Italian or Irish at certain points, versus, and also their cultural differences, right? Like you do have cultural differences. You can't quite erase that and say like that we should all be, we're not all the same. But we should still judge each individual based on their own merits.
Yeah. No, I 100% agree with that. And so, you know, you're talking about individuals, like, let's talk about you in Hungary, which you were there for a while.
I just got back.
And just got back. And, you know, on social media and stuff, you were posting some, I mean, there's a lot of history there. It looks like the architecture is great. Looks beautiful. I know people there don't make that much money. You know, I know some people in Hungary, actually, this is a thing now, like Rod Dreher, who's also on Substack, lives there. You know, various other people, you know, you've met some of them. You know, this is a whole new thing. So Hungary is kind of a little bit of the black sheep in the West. Viktor Orban has been running Hungary for a while as a one man. I mean, this is the perception. I have Hungarian friends that will tell you different things, but I'm just going to give the standard New York Times. Standard New York Times narrative. He's a strong man, anti-democratic, et cetera, et cetera. The main issue with the anti-democratic is he does actually win the election, so it gets a little confusing because it seems like he's broadly popular. You know?
I guess what I would say, I do think he's popular. I think what people who don't like him would also argue is that because he has had control for as long as he had, and he has so much control over media, which some people will dispute, but I'm presenting the alternative view, that is it a full-on democracy? And then other people will say, well, there's just really, like, they might not like him, but there's really no one else, and he has done some good things. So it's a very, I will say it's very controversial. Even within Hungary, when I tried to have as many conversations as I could with people with divergent views on this, and so I definitely got people who love him, think he's like amazing, he's the savior of the country, and other people who absolutely think he's a dictator. And I will say one thing, and this is a general thing that applies to anybody, including in my own country. I mean, I do believe in term limits, and term limits are important. So somebody like Netanyahu or him, who's been running the country for as long as they have, I think that the kind of centralization of power, I don't think is a very healthy thing for democracy. But they would probably argue that by being able to have power for longer and have more terms, they can think more and plan more long-term, as opposed to short-term elections where somebody can only, serve 8 years max. So they're thinking about winning the next election, not necessarily long-term future of their country.
Okay, so this is this right-wing authoritarian country. What's it like being? I mean, did people know you were Jewish? I mean, I don't know. I mean, tell me about it.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think people like randomly meeting me knew, but people who were in my circle that I met did know, because I don't hide it. I felt actually much more comfortable being Jewish there than in most places. I do know that they still have, they have definitely, kind of right wing white supremacist type people for sure. And one experience I had, I wanted to look at some interesting pins. So they have a lot of like little antique shops there with pins and collectibles. And the first place I walked into looked kind of neat. They were friendly. And then I go to the back and they had all this Nazi memorabilia. And I was just like, I have to say that it stunned me, and I didn't feel comfortable purchasing because I didn't know the context of this. And I kind of wondered, why would somebody even buy this or make money off of selling this? So I personally did have a little bit of an issue with that. But in terms of generally, I would say, especially when the attacks happened, I felt like that was the safest place for me to be. I didn't feel, because at the same time, I traveled around a few different places. I went to Prague, Vienna, and London. And Prague, I felt fairly safe and comfortable. And one way to sort of judge these countries also is, are they ripping off posters of kidnapped hostages? Well, Prague seemed intact. Vienna, mixed, but I think they had a lot of like demonstrations there. But one thing that happened, I was on my way to Vienna and I had all these police officers, like 9 of them, board my train. And suddenly they were asking for passports. And I had just, I was just having an argument with my mom saying that you don't need a passport to travel from Budapest to Vienna. And she's like, see, but they didn't, the police officers were only checking certain individuals. So I started looking up, and it was meant to be the day of vengeance, right? So I think it was connected to that. So I think Vienna has a much more unsafe situation. And then in London, every poster was ripped off. I think there was like one baby one left hanging, and every other poster was ripped off. And anytime they get put up, they get ripped off, which I really don't understand the mentality of that. I know some people are like, well, this is miles and miles away, or this is propaganda. But somehow, showing pictures of Palestinian children is not propaganda, which, by the way, I'd never dream of ripping off something like that. So like the mentality that it takes to do it is different. And it does feel less safe. In London, I felt least safe. In Hungary, I would say I felt most safe, especially as a Jewish person. Even despite the history of Hungary, which obviously isn't great in that respect.
So Hungary was allied with the Axis. That's what you're alluding to.
Yeah.
And in the interwar period, it was right wing. Fascist wouldn't be the right word because like that'd be an Italian word, but it was like right wing authoritarian, kind of like Franco, and eventually. They did. I think the Germans and the really, really far right, you can correct me if I'm wrong, eventually did get the Hungarian Jews, but
they're pretty
my
willing to participate. That's one thing. Like, because you can look at certain countries historically. I think Brazil or Argentina? I can't remember. But there were certain countries where the Swiss helped a lot. They didn't hand over their Jews, and either they protected them or they weren't willing.
Denmark, Denmark. Yeah.
So I think that's important because, like, look, I don't hold, because I do let go of I don't blame the offspring of people for the atrocities that their parents even committed, right? I don't. So like going to Germany, or like I remember being in Austria and feeling like weird about it, and then wondering whenever I'd see an older person, I'm like, what was that? What was it like? And this was like my first trip to Europe. But I've thought about it a lot, and I only like I said, I stay consistent about judging individuals based on their own merits and what they believe today. That said, it depends on how the country responded to these atrocities, and did they have a cultural shift overall? And some countries I think have, and some countries might still, there might be some things lingering and underneath the surface too.
Well, brass tacks in terms of, there is because I'm obviously not a Jewish presenting person. That's what I'm going to say. So I do hear things from certain people about Jews, assuming that I have certain opinions because of what I look like, and it's a wide rainbow. It's like a rainbow nation of opinions and people. Let's just put it that way. So I don't want to pin this on any particular group, but you just said, okay, so in Hungary you're pretty safe. Vienna and then London. These are not native English people, or these are not ethnic English people that are causing the problems in London, right? Like, let's just be straight
I
up
would
about
say
it.
for the most part, no, it is not. I think.
I mean, it's not what I saw in the protest because we got video now. We can look,
Yeah. No. And London is a very different country today than it was even a year ago. That was my impression. It's just, or even a few years ago. It's just I've been to London for many years. I would visit it and see it sort of transform and change, and it's really changed a lot. The problem is because I hate for it to sound in any way like this is about Muslims, because it's not. I mean, it is and it isn't. So I've known some incredibly wonderful, warm people who would never hurt a fly who are Muslims. But they also come to these countries and they respect and take on and seek out the values that are sort of the Western sort of democracies and liberal as well. Whereas what I've been seeing is there's certainly a lot of people who come to these countries and for various reasons, sometimes because the quality of life for them is going to be better and they have a lot of money, or I don't really know exactly why they're coming, but the problem is that they're not aligning with the values. And I talk a little bit about this because I'm an immigrant myself and my family is an immigrant family. Even my grandparents came, they were quite old when they moved to the West. And I think there's two things. One is that the government, once they decide to make you a citizen, which they don't have to, and they can have whatever rules they want, but once they take you in, then they are responsible for treating you like any citizen. You have to be equal in every way. And two, you as an immigrant also have a responsibility. And I think it's about culture and adjusting to that, knowing the language and wanting to be a positive part of the community.
Yeah, I've only been to London once. It was in 2010. I was on vacation in Europe, and I will say, my observations, and this is only from 4 days. I have family in England, but whatever. Compared to the U.S., okay, people stared at me when I opened my mouth because I don't sound like I'm from there, which I'm not. Okay, that was so, I'd just be like, hey, can I get that paper? And they'd be like, and I'm just like, what? You never heard someone speak English without an accent? I mean, I didn't say that because they think I have an accent, but
I would have loved to hear you say that. That would have
been, I did get a sense just watching TV and just walking around. I did get a sense that compared to the United States, England, this is in 2010, they were much more upfront of multiculturalism, where each group stays with their own kind and nurtures their own culture. And I would say that that's going to naturally make it a little bit, I mean, some of this stuff is weird. So my family's, I guess I shouldn't say this, but whatever. I mean, my uncle's going to be embarrassed, but my cousins are not very religious, particularly one of my cousins. He drinks just like English people drink, right? And so this whole thing about your friends taking a picture of you and putting it on Facebook when you're passed out, I was like, what's going on? What kind of friends do you have? And then later I found out from all these English people, that's just what we do. And we just get really drunk and hammered. Okay, I can see how Muslims are not going to assimilate into that culture.
Yeah.
Okay?
Which they don't have to. I mean.
Yeah. But I mean, even for an American, it's just out of control. So there's things like that. But then there's other things you're talking about, the values and the civil liberties, attitudes towards, let's say sexual liberality. That's what I'm just going to say, just in terms of you don't control your women. Like, they get to do what they want to do, and if someone's gay, like, that's their business. Like, these sorts of things.
And that's
I
what it should be, somebody's business, because like ultimately, even with a hijab, like I don't want to tell women like they can't wear it. I know in France it's outlawed, and I don't think I agree with that, but I think. But there is a difference between somebody having the environment where they can 100% choose that for themselves, as opposed to it being imposed top down, which is what the issue is, I think, in many of these other countries. And I think the people who come to, say, London, the women, particularly the ones where you really only see their eyes, I think a lot of that happens not because of like free choice, because if it is a free choice, then I like, it's a free choice. She can choose whatever she wants. But it's more so that it becomes that I think a lot of it is, it's like the exact value and the oppressions are coming with that, as opposed to somebody like having absolute freedom to do what they want, and then they still choose to, dress in these ways or dress very modestly. Or, I mean, in the Jewish community, you have similar things, like specifically in the Orthodox or religious, right? Like women cover themselves. And there are cases where I would say that that's oppressive, because these women have been sort of grew up in these highly religious areas and didn't feel like they had any other choice. And in fact, when they want to choose to be different, there's problems that arise. They might lose their children and things like that, versus somebody who, like, I just watched The Jewish Matchmaker, and she's somebody who wasn't an Orthodox Jew, and she became one, but all of that through her own choice and her own understanding. And yes, she dresses modestly, but she does that through free will. And I think that is the key.
Yeah, I mean, choice, liberty. I mean, these are Western values.
Yeah.
So I would say, like, you said you didn't feel safe. Let's talk about concretely, because like, did people get in your face? Were they talking about like Jew this, Jew that? I mean,
yeah.
I mean, just give you some quick context, or to give the listener some quick context, because I've talked about this publicly. Like in certain immigrant communities, in particular, like with Islamic tinge, there's a way of talking about Israel that's very dehumanizing, and Jews that's very dehumanizing. They're kind of LARPing and bullshitting, like the phrase like Hitler should have finished what he started. People say that all the time. Like, would these people really want Jewish children to be gassed? Of course not. They're just LARPing and like, talking shit, right? But I swear to God, like, sometimes I see people talking in public and I'm like, I know where you're getting these reflexes. Like, your private conversations are starting to bleed over,
Yeah.
And so there are things that kids growing up in these communities will hear about Jews and Israelis. And they might not know any Jews or Israelis, And so, they're racist, they're supremacist, they're all these, like, they're devious and they're cunning and they control everything. All of these, tropes, stereotypes, whatever, bleed out.
Well, even the word Zionist, right, which is now being applied like a slur.
Zio.
If you ask them to define what they actually mean by it, it's like so all over the place. Even reasonable people that I like, I had somebody define it, and he defined it as somebody who wants Israel to have all the land of Palestine, and is kind of a supremacist, right? It's not what the word means. And like, all it means is like the right of Jewish self-determination. It means nothing less, nothing more. And how you achieve that, or what you feel is okay, is like, that's highly debatable amongst the whole population. But that's all it means, is that Israel has the right to exist. So in that way, hey, I'm a Zionist, or Zio, whatever you want to call me. But if you're talking about supremacy, or feeling like this is from God, or we're chosen people, or we're better than someone else, like, no. But people come up with their own definitions, and it's become this slur of like these evil people. And so I think having these narratives out there has been really dehumanizing, clearly not just to Israelis, but to Jews, because everyone is called that, because almost every Jew believes that Israel has the right to exist. They might be incredibly sympathetic to Palestinians, some of them, right? Like they might be even activists that work to help, but they're still going to be, okay, like think that Israel shouldn't disappear from the river to the sea, right? And in terms of like, in the context of safety, I think these rhetorics, because what I noticed is, while I certainly don't think that every person who's like super pro-Palestinian or anti-Israel, as long as it's based on facts, on true facts, is an anti-Semite. Certainly, there is a lot of it that is connected to that, and you see that because every time Israel is on the news a lot, you see attacks on Jewish communities around the world. And I had taught at a Jewish girls' school temporarily during COVID, and I don't wear a Star of David. I'm very secular. But they wear clothes that make them very identifiable as Jewish because they were religious girls and they're just children. And there was threats to them. And I started wearing the Star of David because I felt like, listen, if they're gonna be at risk, then I should be. And while I personally didn't experience, by the way, anything while being in London, I'm not like easily identifiable as Jewish. I could be Muslim for all they know. Like often Muslim people think I'm Muslim or Iranian or something like that. So I think that's part of it. I think if I was wearing a Star of David if I was waving an Israeli flag, we've seen the attacks. They do happen. So that's where the fear comes from. And then from seeing like people just like rip off posters, I don't know if I'd be like stabbed or anything, but, was worried about confrontations. And I knew also because I've been so outspoken about Israel, which apparently just means that I want to see children dead, which is not the case at all. I would get like death threats, and I don't necessarily think that they like go into the real world. But at the same time, somebody's willing to send another person a death threat isn't somebody you want to 100% trust being in a room with. So those people exist, and in the right circumstances, they do present a danger, or rather in the wrong circumstances.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess what you're describing is kind of an air of menace.
Yeah. And it makes it, the problem is it's become so normalized, right? So in the past, even the anti-Semitic, Jew-hating, if you don't want to use the word anti-Semitic, but that sentiment has become so normalized. Like before, people would hide it so much more, especially behind the word Zionist. Again, not everyone who uses the word Zionist means that they're anti-Semitic, but many are. And so it's... they would sort of hide behind it and be like, my best friends are Jewish, right? And then what I'm seeing, especially in the discourse online, but not just, it's definitely trickling down into the real world, is that the language has shifted. It's become much more normal to just call somebody a Jew, much more straightforward, and so that normalization and the mass sort of praise of that and the support of that you see online. The problem is, as much as people like to say that it doesn't reflect the real world, behind every screen is a real person, and when they see they say something like Hitler should have finished the job, and people like it, and it spreads and it goes viral, or Zios are evil pigs. That kind of stuff becomes really normalized, and then you see it trickle down into the real world, and then from that we see it progress into violence. And when that violence in particular isn't stopped, or when we see people chanting "Gas the Jews" in Australia, and there's really no consequence to that, then it empowers and emboldens people. And I see that as a big problem.
Yeah, let me just step like in the American context, there's multiple things that I saw in terms of the discourse on safety, inclusiveness, and toleration. One thing that I saw multiple times was, and let's talk a little bit about the gendered aspect here too, because you talked about the poster ripping thing. No one has a good hypothesis for why it looks like 80 to 90% of the people recorded are women doing this, often young women, you know? So that's a weird thing, because at first I thought, well, maybe this is just some weird bias of the initial ones, but it's just continuous. Occasionally you see a dude, but
it is
it's
more women.
it's like 4/5 women. That's one thing. Young women.
College educated, probably.
yeah. And a lot of them are not even Muslim. They're just, anyway. But anyway, like, I mean, I see actually, I don't know. I saw a non-binary person. I think they were a cis woman born, but so it was. But anyway, you see all sorts of weird, like, different types of people that you wouldn't expect doing this. Okay, so that's one thing. Another thing is, there's some Jewish, and again, it's mostly women, that are saying, we're being attacked, we're being verbally abused, we feel unsafe. Why aren't you protecting us? And, the theory here is, again, this is where we're going back to the white, non-white discussion. Well, I mean, they're punching up, et cetera, et cetera. And so I see a lot of Jews realizing, kind of like a scales, like a lot of left-wing woke Jews, seeing what this really is in terms of these sorts of progressive stack ranks and all this stuff. Because the reality is, like, they don't care about your feelings, feelings are only for, like, some people,
And I would say that with the poster ripping, it's sort of like women are worse at also like the cancel culture thing, or like, because there's like a gossip element. Women don't have that's the theory, I guess, is that women don't have that physical power. So they use words, and that's the weapon of choice. But men are much more likely to become physically aggressive. And
Let's go.
Yeah. So we're seeing that with, like, where the fights or physical clashes have happened, it's been mostly men, and where it's been like ripping off of posters or people yelling or things like that, that's been more likely to be female. So I think that's part of it. And yeah, I think a lot of it is the consequence of also that female the power hierarchy ideas that someone by default, if they are seen as having less power, are the victim, and somebody who might have more power, maybe they're more wealthy, maybe they're more educated, inherently are the powerful person, even though it's not necessarily like reflected in the reality of their actions or lies.
Well, I mean, we saw this weird, again, this is would be inexplicable, I think, to someone who didn't understand these sorts of, power relations, identitarian arguments. But with the sexual, I don't want to go into details because it's pretty traumatic. It's pretty weird and uncomfortable. But the sexual stuff, where it's like, there was that Canadian, woman's activist who was basically saying it didn't happen in Israel. And I'm like, come on.
Well, that has been kind of wild, and there's been a few women and a few people trying to kind of call that out, because sort of the idea of like feminists, and especially when we had that era of Me Too just recently, where it's like, believe all women, and suddenly, well, we do not believe women in Israel. There's just general denial of atrocities. Like, I was just in a space yesterday where somebody's saying, well, Muslims don't rape. It's very skeptical that this happened. Meanwhile, there's literally like forensic evidence, and they mostly cite this one article as a way to debunk. All that article said, it was a Haaretz article. All it said was that it was just very difficult to make certain kinds of investigations forensically because of the level of carnage, because of how bad they were and what happened to the bodies. It just made it very difficult. But there's still forensic evidence for the rapes, and also there's witnesses, many, many witnesses. So they're essentially saying everybody's lying. And in the sense of like the people who are like big Palestinian supporters, especially Muslims, I think for them it's more cognitive dissonance, because they don't want to believe it, because it's very hard to support. So it's easier to sort of deny. And then with the women's organizations, yeah, I mean, I don't know. I guess it's like, it's a power thing maybe. And it's also, a lot of them, to me, I'm not sure that they really cared about women. They clearly care about optics and how they appear. And I think because it's not that they don't even think, I don't even think they don't believe it happened. It's just not very popular to speak about it and be attached to it. Just like, why do they take off the posters of kidnapped people? And what people have sort of indicated to me, they're not necessarily the kinds of people would take them off, but they were like, well, this is propaganda. Why is it even being hung? It's like, you're not allowed to call attention to victims because the other entity is also seen as the victimizer. But the victims are still victims, even if you believe that Israel is an evil state, terrorist state, as they call it. It doesn't mean that the people who were, hurt, murdered, tortured, raped, all that kind of stuff, are not still legitimate victims. But there is this kind of both. There were two sort of narratives happening here. One is that they're not victims because it's a genuine act of resistance. You can do whatever you want, but then they'll also go and deny some of the extreme atrocities and to sort of, I think, make peace with it so they can uphold their position. But I have to say, at this point, if you haven't watched, if you don't believe that this happened, it's intentional, because there's so much footage. And I went and I thought I was pretty strong. I can kind of try to separate myself a bit from the stuff that I see. But I went on there's a group that documents all the different atrocities. So there's some videos there that haven't been as public. And it's like, God, I was weeping, and I will never unsee this. So I had trauma just from watching the videos. So I can't imagine the people who were there. And it's nothing, like, you don't have humanity if you don't find this abhorrent. And it's not hard to find, but also people demand to see the evidence. And it's like, there is already quite a bit of evidence.
You can find it. You can find it.
There's reporting, but also you don't want to be. So one thing, I wasn't sure. Do you share this stuff? Do you not? The problem with it, and I think in the beginning of the war, Israel said not to share it because they knew there were going to be videos coming out. And I thought, why don't they want to share it? And I had a conversation with somebody, and he said, the problem is, so a regular human being is going to react like you and I will, which will be appalled. This is awful. But again, regardless of what side you're on, so-called side. But the people who are radical, to them, it's actually empowering, and it can cause further violence. So that's part of why you don't want to share. And then, of course, the dignity of the people who've been murdered, tortured, humiliated. I mean, the stuff that I saw, certainly nobody would, if you had family members, they would certainly not want to share that. So, yeah.
One thing that I want to just highlight here, we're talking about like women and, some of the, obviously some of the hostages, they're women and they're IDF soldiers. And this is just a function of the fact that Israel has to militarize and mobilize its whole society. And that's just what it is. So one thing that I think it was like 23 sentry posts around the, it was mostly manned by female soldiers. I think all of them were female soldiers, right? And they were all overwhelmed. Now, some of this is just surprised, but I will say here, and I'm not like saying this because I'm happy about it, but in American media right now, there's just a trope of like these like women that are like beating men up and stuff like that. But in the real world, that does not happen, because men are much stronger upper body. That's why women have to do, martial arts that use their leverage and everything like that, right?
I've done jiu-jitsu. I know men are stronger.
Yeah. And so I just have to say it's like kind of sad, but I'm like, oh, okay, well, they were surprised. They're off balance, and they're probably almost certainly much physically weaker. So these women were overpowered. And so like, yeah, you might be a badass IDF soldier, but you're a woman now. And they killed a bunch of them, but they actually kidnapped a bunch of them too, apparently. And they're not going to be released anytime soon because they're IDF soldiers.
Yeah, well, and children, and yeah, of course, everyone. I mean, they kidnapped pretty and killed kind of indiscriminately. I think it's also important to note that they killed Arabs, right? So it wasn't they, and they kidnapped some Thai people, so they didn't care. I mean, I'm sure they were more wanting to murder Jews than Arab Israelis, but they still see them. I mean, they just recently hung. Or prosecuted, executed on the streets some Palestinian people, right? Because they called them collaborators with Israel, and then they shot. They forced somebody to take them to the festival. There's a video of that, and he's an Arab. So I mean, it was indiscriminate. And in fact, I think it's also important to note that so for Jews, they do have to serve in the IDF. I'm actually against conscription, but that's an aside. But Jewish people are it's mandatory conscription, but for Arabs it's not. And I think it's because they realize like they might have to fight their own people, so they give them the choice, but they can choose to join. And we've seen a lot of Arabs, Bedouins actually go and sign up because they saw what they did, what these, savages, whatever you want to call them, what they did, the butchers, and they killed, they also killed their friends, and their friends might have been Jewish, might have been Arab. It doesn't matter. They saw it and they were willing to come and join the army.
Yeah, I mean, the whole like Israeli Arab, Israeli Palestinian, whatever you want to call it, identity is a bit of a paradox. I've talked to my friend who I mentioned, his family, I mean, they're Palestinian. They agree with the Palestinian movement, but they have also encountered a lot of hostility from people who had left or who are from the West Bank because they're like you're traitors, and they're just in a messed up position in a lot of ways. It's kind of I'm not gonna say worst of all worlds, but they have to deal with like kind of like whipsaw back and forth. On the other hand, there are these like religious Zionists that are like, you don't belong in this country, and then there's the Palestinians outside of Israel who are like, what are you doing with the Jews? And so they're not going to win either way. One thing I want to mention, since we're back on the attacks, Captagon is some sort of amphetamine. Apparently a lot. I mean, this was very common in Syria too. A lot of the attackers were on Captagon, and so in terms of their behavior, I've read some military history and how things happen in wars. One reason the communists in China succeeded and beat the nationalists is they had the support of a lot of the populace because Mao and his army, he directed them not to, engage in like wanted destruction, plunder, rapes, whereas the nationalist forces of Chiang Kai-shek did.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's not like armies don't always engage in this sort of behavior. Peter Turchin, who has done work that shows if it's a different cultural group, there tends to be, frankly, much more of this sort of atrocity. So, for example, in the Civil War, there was very little of this, contrary to what, maybe in some depictions. In general, the Union and the Confederacy, they still viewed themselves, brother against brother, that sort of issue.
Well, I was going to say, a lot of it is also how much you dehumanize the other.
Yeah. And so I think, there's some hostility there going on. They're on drugs. It doesn't seem like they were even under these young men, and a lot of them were teenagers. Combination of drugs, amphetamines, living in Gaza for basically your whole life under the blockade and getting a certain bit of propaganda, and also experiencing, a certain level of oppression, being surrounded by another state. And then, just like being, teenage boys are monsters. They can be. I was one once,
Mm-hmm.
I'm not trying to justify it, but sometimes I think when people just say, I don't like it, and we did this during the War on Terror, they're just evil. Yeah, what they did was evil. But saying that people are evil kind of turns it into this like mysterious black box. It's not a mysterious black box. Like combined resentment, ethnic hatred, guys that are 17, on drugs.
We know that not everyone okay, so one of the justifications for these actions that people say, there's all this oppression. They see the bad things happening to them in the hands of the Israelis or murders, whatever. But then we see people come out of that and be like completely decent humans, and they've had, in fact, worse things happen to them, and they're still decent humans. Now, we can't predict how each of us is going to be, but as a whole, like, I don't think it's like immediately makes it like, oh, this happened because of this. There is something, I guess, cultural, and by cultural, I also mean, look, a lot of these. I got in trouble for a tweet about how I said not all children are innocent. And what I meant with that was, because it was definitely taken in context. One, I was thinking about, there's this girl who was like a serial killer. So by inherently, she was not innocent. She killed kids and she was a kid. And then the other thing that I was thinking about was in the context of, how in the Congo, the child soldiers, right? And those are both victims and perpetrators, because they are victims because often they didn't have a choice, right? Like, they were sometimes they were forced to kill their own parents. And imagine what that does to a person psychologically. And there's still a human somewhere under that, but they were they were indoctrinated, they were manipulated psychologically to become these entities that are going to kill you, right? And if somebody pointed a gun, and even if they were 8 years old, I mean, that's very young, but it still happens, sadly. Like, what are you going to do? Be like, that's a child, therefore, if your only chance was to protect another child was to shoot them, if you're a parent, you're going to shoot them. And that's the reality. And you can lie about it, but it's true. And is that kid still a victim in that situation, the 8-year-old with the gun? I think so. I think they are, because sometimes they will get, if they're lucky, they've gotten sort of rescued from those environments and deprogrammed, and it's very difficult, and they have so much trauma, and they become normal, decent human beings. So they are victims, and there's still a person underneath it. But at the same time, you still have to deal with the reality of someone pointing a gun, or somebody, shooting a missile, or doing whatever they're doing. And so in some ways they're victims because they were indoctrinated throughout their whole lives for this, to hate, to feel oppressed, to be, again, whether some of that oppression is true or not, like, that's what they believe in a genuine way, in such an extreme way, that they're willing to go and kill for it, and they're willing to die for it. So you can almost have sympathy, but at the same time, it's very difficult to do that when you see somebody, do really conduct atrocious behavior. And certainly it's a little bit different when it's like a child soldier who's been torn from their family and really traumatized, versus like a grown up who, sort of chose by their own means to do this.
Yeah. So the last thing I'll say about the kids, this is kind of weird, but the novel Ender's Game, Orson Scott Card, the protagonists are tweens. Mm-hmm. And the reason that they're tweens is, their mental faculties are somewhat developed, but their morality is not all there. So the idea is, if you had an adult might not be able to go through with like pressing a button and like basically exterminating a whole species, which
yeah. And we've seen that, by the way. Like, I watched a documentary that's like takes place in prison, Music from the Big House, which actually had a big impact on me and how I see prison reform, but and just prisoners. But some of the people who were in prison were committed their crimes, which were murder, like as really young, like adolescents or very young adults. Their brains were not developed. They were not. And I mean, the crime still happened. They did it. They took somebody's life, and they have to live with that for the rest of their lives. But you can see that they're a very different person today. They're not the same person who would have pressed that button so willingly. So I do think considering that is important, and considering the factors that might lead to it. And I mean, I also think teens have agency, but teens are not, their brains are not fully developed also. So that's why we do try kids and we do try teenagers, but we might not always try them in the same ways as an adult for a reason. And sometimes we do in some extraordinary cases. So as a legal system, we consider those things as well. But at the same time, you're always dealing with the reality of the situation, which is that person is a danger to you or to someone else. And so how do you neutralize the problem in a way that doesn't endanger more people is the action you're going to take. And if you can take that person down without hurting them, and not risking some other people's lives, that's great. That's the desirable outcome. And sometimes you're not in a position to do that. And so unfortunately you have to take them down.
Yeah, there's no easy answers. So I mean, we've been talking for a while. I wanna just close out more about, like, in the North American context. Say North America because you're Canadian. I gotta say North America. There's that country up there. It's a big country, but there's not that many people in it.
I say North America, but because I spent so much time in the U.S. too, I'm like, I'm kind of part of it.
Well, so today, fellow Substacker pundit Matt Iglesias talking about the Israel issue. That's actually it is a wedge issue in the Democratic Party. Jews have traditionally been Democrat, left leaning in the United States, and but there's now a lot of left wing people and also minorities who are much more skeptical of Israel. The surveys show that really, like, a lot of Black Americans are pretty identified with Palestinians. With the Latinos, it's much more mild. They're usually with Latinos, like, they're a little bit more liberal on a lot of issues than white people, not that much more. You know what I'm saying? Except for abortion, where they're more conservative, whatever. But anyway, and then, the other groups are small proportions. So recently we had Rashida Tlaib, who's a Palestinian, congressperson, and she contextualized from the river to the sea. The interesting thing here for me is, what we've been told the last 5 to 10 years, what I've been told, actually, I remember my academic friends 15 years ago, you do not contextualize for someone taking offense or hurt to them to explain how they're supposed to take something. Whereas that's exactly what she's doing here. Because I get what she's saying, and maybe she doesn't want to exterminate. She probably doesn't, actually,
Probably doesn't. No.
Yeah. But I also get why Jews are freaking out when you say that, because when you see people in the Arab world or somewhere screaming from, whatever, they don't look very friendly.
And they're normalizing a phrase that is actually genocidal. I understand that. I actually do agree, and I think that most protesters who chant that do so without understanding the context of their phrase or taking the context away, and what they want, or not thinking through, because, well, from the river to sea, even if you're not talking about exterminating Jews, which obviously in some Arab countries they absolutely very directly are, and they don't even hide it, but with these people chanting, it's still about Palestinians. Basically, it's a one-state solution where obviously Palestinians are the majority, and therefore they rule. And I ask people, okay, how to think through the consequences of that? And when I've gotten an answer, one person in particular, Kim Iverson, she basically said, the Jews, I think what will happen is they'll live in peace next to each other. Many Jews will go back to where they came from, which, imagine that statement, and hey, you immigrant, go back to where you came from. And the kind of idea that they would just live next to each other when October 7th just happened, but also years and years of attacks and conditioning, and Hamas being the rulers, and Hamas saying we will continue killing them. That's what we want, is the extermination of Jews. It's just, I think people are just not even thinking through these things that they're saying. Or they're thinking, Jews don't belong here and they should go to the places where they came from, which in their understanding is Europe, which they lack the context of hey, there's a reason why, first of all, every Arab country, there's almost no Jews left in any of them. One. And most of the Jews in Israel are from these countries. and two, or European countries where we also faced massive prosecution, which is why we left in the first place. So I think, honestly, there's just a cognitive dissonance. I think there's a lack of thinking through things in context. And I don't think most of the people chanting from the river to the sea are actually thinking this is the extermination of the Jews that they're calling for. I really don't. You have to be like, good faith in these conversations and arguments, but including as much as I don't like her, our friend. But I think that the consequence of that phrase, even if it's not genocidally meant, is still about, one group of people not being allowed to be in that piece of land. So the elimination of Israel is still what they're ultimately chanting from, whether they recognize that or not.
Well, so I think the issue here, I mean, not that it matters that people in Palestine and Israel and Gaza have more context and more history, but here in the United States, what's going on? It's gonna be a slogan. That's all it's gonna be. It's gonna be a meme. There's nothing beyond the meme.
Well, think about why, I know people like to say that the reason people take up like anti-Israel positions or pro-Palestinian positions is all anti-Semitism. And I don't think that's actually true. I think there's not a small group of people who are anti-Semitic or hate Jews. But there's also a group of people. There is a reason, like, these things get disproportionate coverage. And there's, like we talked about earlier, like there's a lot of conflicts going on in the world, even for Ukraine, which was like on the left pretty universally accepted that was wrong.
Wait, what? Ukraine? What country? No, I'm just talking.
Yeah, nobody remembers that anymore. But did you see? I mean, this was a very highly covered thing, but there still wasn't like 500,000 people on the streets. So I think a lot of it is about the PR. And people care about what they see, and when they see, the visual, again, is images of children. The fact that there's so many people who speak out, that it's being made to be the underdog, and a lot of the phrasing I notice is like, nobody's speaking about this, nobody cares, and which makes them immediately the underdog that people cheer for, even though that's factually not true, because there's quite a bit more chatter online, empirically, and celebrities and things like that that are pro-Palestine than there is pro-Israel. In fact, it's a much more uncomfortable position to hold. You're going to get attacked far more.
Well, so I remember this was like 20 or 25 years ago. I looked into the, demographic issues. And so, Shadi Hamid, my friend Shadi Hamid, talked about how, it doesn't really matter what you like, I myself, like, I'm not like, I don't think the Holy Land, I don't personally feel it's holy because I don't believe in any of those. You know what I'm saying?
Well,
if I was Jewish, if I was Jewish or whatever, or Muslim or whatever, I would have a different opinion maybe. So for me, it's just another country. Like, why are people out in the streets? Why do they care that much? Whereas 5 million people are on the move in Sudan.
Yeah.
Okay, so what's going on here? Well, he's like, but this is just the reality. Like, half the world's population believes in these religions, and it's going to matter to them. Okay, that's fair.
But most of those people on the streets are probably secular. Like, I don't even.
Yeah, but they come from a particular cultural context, right?
Okay, yeah.
They come from a particular cultural context. Okay, so one reason that Gaza has so many young people and its total fertility rate was so high, or it's not the total fertility rate, but its growth was so high, is because its mortality rate for children was actually quite low, because the UN and all these NGOs went into Gaza. They don't go into a lot of they don't go into a lot of African countries that have these sorts of political turmoils. And so, again, I think it's an interesting fact that because people care so much about this part of the world, they devote a lot of resources. They devote a lot of material resources. The EU puts money in, the UN puts money in, and then they devote a lot of emotional and intellectual research. So I think we're stuck with that. I guess, like, as we close out, I just want to ask you, I mean, what are you anticipating going forward? Because we have a situation where, especially the left, the center to the left, let's put it that way, is split on the Israel-Palestine issue. And, I know that Israel says they're going to destroy Hamas, but those people in Gaza not going to be scattered to the rest of the world. They're going to be there. And so we're going to have to deal with a generational problem and also a foreign policy issue in the United States that's split. And then you have people like you, we're Jewish. You're not living in Israel. You're not primarily Israeli. You're in the middle. I mean, what do you see going forward?
Yeah, so I'll answer the last question first. Whether, because one thing is, like, I am Canadian. I have Canadian citizenship. I grew up here. I do care about Israel. I am also an Israeli citizen, but I don't live in Israel. So my primary sort of responsibility is ultimately for Canada, because I think that's the morally correct thing. That said, doesn't mean I can't care about the outcome of Israel, and I do. In terms of like going forward, I've thought about this a lot. I think it's such a difficult thing, and something that people rightfully bring up is that, well, if you're going to destroy Hamas, but you've now destroyed Gaza and you've killed so many people. I certainly know people who've lost people, so I don't know what the actual numbers are, and I don't know if it's accurate. Like some of them were killed as a consequence of Hamas, but leaving that aside, there's still people who've been killed, and are they not just going to be radicalized again, and they're going to become another Hamas, and maybe even worse than Hamas, which is hard to imagine, but here we are. And I think that's a concern that I myself have had. And I think going forward, the way to certainly Israel has to get rid of Hamas and all their infrastructure. And I think they will accomplish this fairly soon. So the next step is going to be, I think, really cooperating with certain Arab countries that have normalized relationships with Israel. And I think Israel is just not going to say any of this publicly right now for obvious reasons, but I think that's probably what's going on behind the scenes. I think they're negotiating a lot of this. Unlike how many people think that they're going to just be displacing Palestinians, I really don't think that's going to be the case at all. I think they're going to stay or return to Gaza, and the West Bank is its own issue, but we'll leave it for now. But I think what they're going to have to do is rebuild Gaza and make it really good, and I think control the education, so that there's not going to be like radicalized elements within it. I think they're going to need the cooperation of the Arab world. I think they're going to have to find cooperation from Palestinians who are more moderate and want a better future for their people, because it doesn't work if nothing really tends to work if it's just up for pushing down, right? So I think some of it has to come from the people, and sometimes this feels honestly somewhat hopeless because I don't know whether this will work or not. But I think the only way forward is to really build a very, very strong, wonderful place to live for people in Gaza, give them educational opportunities. There's different de-radicalization methods that can be used, that have been used. And Netanyahu actually said in his space with Elon, he cited some examples in the Arab world where they've become more de-radicalized, more secular. And I think, so I think they have a strategy. I don't think it's going to be short term. I think it's going to be a long road, and I think it's going to be difficult, and I don't know whether it's going to be successful or not. But I also think they cannot do it without the support of at least some Arab states. And we've seen some of them do have better relationships with Israel, because they care about the prosperity of their people and not just sowing hate. And we've seen in the votes within the Arab League that some of them, refuse to sort of condemn Israel. So that's really interesting, and that's very telling. So I think that Israel is probably cooperating with those entities, and I think they have, at least Netanyahu did, regardless what we think of him, I did agree of what he said, where he really seems to want to build, or at least I hope he wants to build a really prosperous Gaza. And ideally, it's going to be a Gaza with very high-tech jobs, like higher education, because that's, I think, the way out. When people have something they love, and they need to have their dignity too. Once they, they're not going to be as inclined to want to just to give up everything and destroy everything for the sake of war and horror. So I really hope for both the Gaza people and Israeli people once it's not a physical threat, there is no reason to have any of the other issues, right? Like, I would be outspokenly against any of the other things that Israel engages in if there was no threat going on. But obviously people in Gaza also need to feel like they have some sovereignty and they have some dignity, which I think is an issue as well. So I think all of that needs to be addressed. And, I don't know whether they will succeed, but I'm trying to be optimistic.
Yeah, I mean that's all you can do. I mean, there's a lot of difficult choices, and sometimes people have to do what they have to do, and they're not going to make a lot of people happy. They're not going to make anyone happy, possibly, but you're boxed in. Are you feeling? I guess last question is: are you feeling, optimistic as a Canadian Jew? Spends part of their time in Europe, part of the time in the U.S., Canada. I mean, some of my Jewish friends are feeling really black-pilled about this sort of stuff in terms of just really negative. Like, what's our future in these countries? Should we do Aliyah? I mean, that's mostly just talk, but still, it's a bad scene. Like, how are you feeling?
No, I've been more negative than I have ever been. I would say I have a lot of fears in regards to this that I hadn't experienced before. I don't know where it's going to go. I try to remain optimistic because that's my nature, and I think my nature is try to do what I can do to try and help the situation. And one thing I will say that's encouraging is like, so a lot of people, people are more radical, are much more likely to take to the streets and protest, and people are emotional. The average person is less likely to do so. And we've now seen there was a protest that's about for Israel that was and bringing back the hostages. It was about, I read that was about 300,000 people in Washington, D.C. And that was like surprising and great to see. In London, there was a smaller one with 60,000 people. So there is some light. And I've also seen people who I've previously talked to when I started pointing out, because I was starting to experience a lot more kind of anti-Semitic attacks before all of this. And when I would talk about it, I would get kind of gaslit, like, this is not real, or are you really interpreting, are you crying wolf, essentially, right? And I'm not somebody who does. I mean, there were very, very blatant things. And now the same people said, listen, I was wrong. I see it very clearly now, but I had no idea it was this bad. So the hope is that the people who have strong morals, who stand up and speak out, which is, it's interesting because I wrote a book, No Apologies, and it is all about speaking out ultimately, and free speech, and the silencing of people, and how important it is for people to use their voices. And it's interesting how much it also relates to this situation, because at the time when I was writing it, we were looking more into things that had to do, with culture war type things. But this now has become in many ways life and death. And it's been so normalized to not speak out because people are so scared of the consequences. But as one person I interview in the book says, it's not like people used to. We shouldn't expect comfort. The fact that we think we should be safe is kind of a modern way of thinking, because people risked their lives and would go to wars. That is not a given, the safety. And now we're scared we're just going to get somebody be mean to us, over our words. So I don't think you need to stick your neck out every situation, but for the things that really matter, I think people need to speak out, because if we don't speak out, the people who run things end up being the people who are the most radical, loudest voices with megaphones. And they don't necessarily represent all of us or the majority of us. But if we don't speak, if we don't push back against bad ideas or bad actions, then they are the ones who get to run things. And what kind of world do we want to live in? That's why we each have a responsibility, I think, to speak.
Yeah, no, that's well said. I'll just close out by, you mentioned your book, No Apologies: How to Find and Free Your Voice in the Age of Outrage, Lessons for the Silent Majority. It is out in January of 2024. So little after this is going to be posted. This is posted, so keep an eye out on that for that.
Can also pre-order.
Yeah, you can pre-order. I'll put the link there in the show notes. We've been talking for a while. It was a pleasure, as always, talking to you, Katherine, and best of luck on everything. I hope you settle back in for the holiday season, back from Europe, and it was great talking. Obviously, we have been talking for almost 2 hours, so I enjoyed it.
Yeah, I enjoyed it too. I hope people enjoy listening and are on board. And I think it was an interesting conversation also because I think you have a different perspective on some of the things, and I think it's important to speak with people who come in good faith, like you do, and have an understanding. We have a similar understanding of reality, at least, right, from which we can speak, but we don't have to agree. And I think it's important. And it hones our own ways of thinking when we talk to someone like that, and B, I think it's a better way towards progressing towards finding some semblance of truth in the world. So I appreciate the conversation.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it too, and I guess that's well said. Again, it's the message of your book. Like, speak up. There's a lot of different voices, a lot of different opinions, a lot of different views. Don't be quiet. Don't let the most extreme radical views, the egotistical, self-important people that think that they know everything, and from a simple meme, speak up, because this is complicated and we're all in this world together, and it can only get better with us all offering our opinions to create the best solutions for all the myriad problems we have. So thank you, Katherine.
Thank you. And I hope people, when they offer their opinions, they also take the time to listen and study. So, but I think, unfortunately, it's the unreasonable voices that tend to be the loudest, but it's the reasonable voices that we need to hear the most.
Well, they have the start, so let's finish it.
That's right. Exactly. I like that approach. Thank you so much.
Whole genome sequencing is used for adults and children every day to assess risk for thousands of diseases. Orchid, a genetics company led by scientists from Stanford, is able to do this for IVF embryos. Now, instead of waiting for a diagnosis, parents can assess if their embryos have genetic variants known to cause severe conditions before their child's even born. No other tests can detect these issues so thoroughly or so early. So check them out at orchidhealth.com.
This podcast for kids. This